What if the Vikings conquered America? And I do not mean they landed in Newfoundland, built a few houses, and then left. I mean, what if they stayed, and over the next few centuries, their settlement grew into towns and trading ports, and eventually a whole Norse civilization along the Atlantic coast? By the time Columbus arrived, he would not find an isolated continent waiting to be divided up. He would find Norse kingdoms trading with powerful indigenous nations, and cities where Christianity existed next to local traditions. The United States probably never exists. New York has a completely unpronounceable Norse name, and the Minnesota Vikings finally make historical sense. But finding America was never the unlikely part. The Vikings already did that. The difficult part was keeping it. Around the year 1000, Norse explorers reached what is now Newfoundland, and built a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows. The site proves they crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus, and for a short time they repaired ships, worked iron, and explored the coast. The land itself was not the problem. Compared with Greenland, it had forests, fish, animals, and enough useful resources to feel like somebody had upgraded the entire North Atlantic. The problem was logistics. A permanent colony needed food, livestock, tools, skilled workers, and enough families that the population did not disappear after one extremely awkward generation. All of that had to cross the ocean, while the settlers were entering land already used by people who understood the region far better than they did. In our timeline, relations broke down and the Norse abandoned Vinland. So this is where things change. This expedition includes more families, more livestock, and enough craftsmen to survive without immediately begging Greenland for another delivery. The settlers build proper winter housing, storage buildings, and a defended harbor, and most importantly, they avoid turning every meeting with the local population into a fight. There are still conflicts because medieval diplomacy was often just violence, followed by somebody explaining why the violence was justified. But trade survives. The Norse offer iron tools and cloth, while local communities provide food, furs, and knowledge about the land. Then another ship arrives, and then another. Not an invasion fleet, because Greenland could barely support itself, but enough people come over the next few decades for Vinland to become a real settlement, with farms, workshops, a church, and children who have never seen Europe. By the middle of the 11th century, only a few hundred Norse settlers may live there, but that is enough. Vinland has survived. Now it has to become valuable enough that people keep coming. It has to make money. And fortunately for Vinland, it has something the rest of the Norse Atlantic desperately needs: trees. Greenland has plenty of ice and rocks and wind strong enough to remove your roof, but very little usable timber, which is a problem when your entire society depends on wooden ships. Vinland has forests everywhere, so timber begins moving east, while iron tools, cloth, and livestock move west. And once ships are already making the journey, they can also carry fish, furs, and other goods that are valuable in Greenland, Iceland, and eventually Norway. Vinland is still dangerous and remote, but now it is profitable, and that changes who is willing to go there. The first settlers came because they were explorers, or because somebody related to Leif Erikson convinced them this was a good idea. The next wave includes merchants' younger sons with no land to inherit, or farmers looking for better soil, and criminals who have recently discovered that a new continent is an excellent place to avoid awkward legal questions. Small settlements begin appearing farther along the coast and near major rivers, because water is still the easiest way to move people and cargo through a landscape nobody has properly mapped. But expansion also makes Vinland harder to control. The settlements are far apart, and the King of Norway is several thousand kilometers away. So local leaders begin solving problems themselves through councils and assemblies based on the Norse equivalent. They negotiate trade agreements, settle land disputes, and organize defense without waiting months for somebody in Europe to answer a letter. By the end of the 12th century, Vinland is no longer just one isolated colony. It is a loose network of farms, ports, and trading towns with its own local leaders and a population increasingly born in America. But every new settlement takes more land, and every new trading route connects the Norse with more indigenous nations. Some of those relationships are profitable, others are about to become violent. The people you are fighting know every river, forest, and mountain around you, so Vinland cannot expand through conquest alone. Some settlements fight their neighbors, while others trade with them, and before long, both sides begin forming alliances against rival groups, because nothing creates international cooperation quite like finding somebody you both dislike more. Norse leaders marry into local families, and indigenous warriors join Vinland's conflicts, while Norse traders travel farther inland using routes that already existed long before they arrived. The result is not peaceful, and it is definitely not equal. Settlements are attacked, and land is taken, and entire alliances collapse, when one leader decides that an agreement signed by his father is apparently no longer his problem. But over several generations, the people living around Vinland begin to change each other. The Norse adopt local foods, clothing, and survival techniques, while nearby communities gain access to iron tools, livestock, and Atlantic trade. Children grow up speaking more than one language, and towns begin combining Norse halls and churches with building methods better suited to the local climate. Vinland stops being a copy of Scandinavia. It becomes its own society. Local assemblies based on the Norse way now include powerful families whose ancestors were not Norse at all, and Christianity spreads, but it develops alongside traditions that the church repeatedly tries to remove and repeatedly discovers are still there. By the 13th century, Vinland controls several parts of the northeastern coast, but most of the continent remains outside its power. It is less an empire and more a growing collection of ports, farms, and allied territories held together by family connections and the general understanding that fighting together is usually better than being conquered separately. And just as this new society begins to stabilize, the world that created it starts disappearing. The Viking Age is ending. By the 14th century, Scandinavia has changed. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden are becoming centralized Christian kingdoms, and the old world of independent chieftains and seasonal Viking expeditions is disappearing. Vinland still trades across the Atlantic, but it is no longer anybody's main priority, because European kings have wars, taxes, and several relatives claiming their throne to deal with. Then the climate gets colder. Sea ice makes the journey between Greenland and Vinland more dangerous, while harvests fail and Greenland's Norse settlements begin shrinking just as they did in our timeline. But this time, the people of Greenland have somewhere better to go. Instead of slowly disappearing, many families sail west to Vinland, where the climate is milder and there is actual farmland, which is useful because stubbornly farming frozen rocks is not a long-term economic strategy. This migration gives Vinland more settlers, ships, animals, and skilled workers, but it also cuts the colony's last reliable connection to Europe. Norway may still claim that Vinland belongs to the crown, but a king who cannot send soldiers, collect taxes, or even guarantee that his letter arrives does not control very much. Local assemblies take over more authority, and the largest ports begin acting like independent states while still cooperating on trade and defense. Over time, these settlements form a loose federation led by powerful Norse and indigenous families who now have far more in common with each other than with rulers across the Atlantic. By the early 15th century, Vinland is no longer a European colony. It is an independent American civilization with its own language, laws, and political system, even if everyone involved still argues about which king they technically owe loyalty to. And this is where the timeline becomes much bigger than Vinland, because contact across the Atlantic has been happening for hundreds of years. People have crossed it, animals have crossed it, and unfortunately, diseases have crossed it too. European diseases still cause enormous damage, because indigenous populations have no previous immunity to many of them. But instead of arriving in one overwhelming wave after 1492, they spread through a series of smaller outbreaks over several hundred years. Entire communities disappear and political systems collapse, while others recover and gradually become more resistant. And Vinland suffers as well, because by this point, its population is heavily mixed, and its towns are connected to trade routes stretching far inland. The result is still catastrophic, but it does not give later European invaders the same sudden advantage they received in our timeline. So when Columbus sails west in 1492, he still reaches the Caribbean, and still returns to Spain claiming he has found a new route to Asia, because apparently admitting you are lost is not how you secure funding for a second expedition. But Northern Europe is much less impressed. Merchants in England and Scandinavia already know there is land across the Atlantic, and Vinland has spent centuries trading from the coast. So Columbus has not discovered a new world. He has arrived several hundred years late, and in the wrong part of it. Spain begins building colonies in the Caribbean, while England, France, and Denmark send ships toward the north, and each of them expects Vinland to accept European authority, because European empires have always been very confident when explaining who owns places where other people already live. Vinland refuses. Its ports are fortified, and its leaders understand European weapons and diplomacy, while powerful indigenous nations can play the new arrivals against each other instead of facing one united invasion. By the 16th century, North America becomes a competition between Vinland indigenous federations and several European empires, rather than a continent divided mainly between Britain, France, and Spain, which means the 13 British colonies never develop in the same way, and without them, there is no United States. Without 13 British colonies, there is no American Revolution in the form we recognize, and no single country expands from the Atlantic to the Pacific, while insisting that this was somehow inevitable. Instead, North America remains divided between several major powers. Vinland controls much of the northeastern coast and the North Atlantic trade, while indigenous federations remain powerful farther inland, and France, England, Spain, and later Mexico control different territories around them. Vinland itself is no longer particularly Viking in the way we imagine the word today. Nobody is commuting to work in a longship or resolving tax disputes with an axe, because a civilization that survives for 800 years eventually develops paperwork. Its political system probably grows out of the old local assemblies, with towns and regions sending representatives to a national thing, while an elected leader or constitutional king handles foreign affairs and defense. The population speaks a language descended from Old Norse, but shaped by centuries of contact with indigenous languages and later English, French, and Danish. So modern Vinlanders might understand Scandinavians in roughly the same way an English speaker understands somebody reading Beowulf. Basically, not very well, but with occasional moments of confidence. Industrialization turns Vinland into a major shipbuilding and trading power, because controlling ports between Europe and North America remains extremely useful, even after ships stop being made from wood. Its closest relationships are probably with Scandinavia and the British Isles, but culturally, it sees itself as American, because most families have lived there for centuries, and a large part of the population has both Norse and indigenous ancestry. By 2026, the continent might contain 5 or 6 major countries, instead of 3. There could be a Vinland Federation in the northeast, and powerful indigenous states around the Great Lakes and Central Plains, while French and English-speaking countries occupy parts of the south and west, and Mexico controls much more territory than it does in our timeline. There is no Washington, D.C., and no United States flag on the moon, and the world never experiences an American superpower in quite the same way. Maybe Vinland becomes the dominant country on the continent, but it would probably remain smaller than the United States, which means Europe stays more influential, and global power is divided between more countries. And despite the title, the Vikings never really conquer America through one enormous invasion. They conquer part of it by surviving long enough to become permanent, and then trading and fighting and marrying into the societies around them, until Vinland is no longer a foreign settlement sitting on the edge of the continent. So would Viking America become a stable federation? Or would it split into 20 kingdoms all claiming to be the real Vinland? Leave your version in the comments and subscribe for more alternate history.